Welcome again. I am Amarachi Ubani in Lagos. The family of late Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny are seeking answers to his death after being denied access to the morgue where his body is thought to be held. His wife, Yulia Navalnaya, in a surprise video, accused the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, of killing the father of her children. In her words, Putin didn't only kill Alexei Navalny as a person, he wanted to kill our hope, our freedom, our future. I will continue Alexei Navalny's work, continue to fight for our country, and I call on all of you to stand alongside me. Now, separately, at least 366 people have reportedly been detained across Russia since Friday for attending vigils and rallies in honor of the late Kremlin critic. However, the Kremlin has said an investigation into the circumstances around Navalny's death is underway, adding that the results are currently unknown. Many world leaders are praising Alexei Navalny as Russia's most prominent opposition politician, laying the blame for his death on the Kremlin. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said Navalny paid for his courage with his life. U.S. President Joe Biden said his death in jail is more evidence of Vladimir Putin's brutality. The European Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell says a bloc must send a message of support to the Russian opposition as members are expected to discuss new sanctions against Moscow. For the United Nations spokesperson, Stefan Dujarric, the Secretary General, is shocked by the report of Navalny's demise.
The Secretary General is shocked by the reported death in detention of opposition figure Alexei Navalny. The Secretary General expresses his condolences to Mr. Navalny's family and calls for a full, credible, and transparent investigation into the circumstances of Mr. Navalny's reported death in custody.
Joining me now is Dr. David Stone, a William E. Odom Professor of Russian Studies and affiliated to the Strategy and Policy Department of the Naval War College in Rhode Island, the United States. Dr. Stone, thank you for joining us on the program.
My pleasure to be here.
And for a lot of people who may not understand, how important Alexei Navalny was, could you take us back to explain how he became such a prominent opposition political figure in Russia?
Certainly. So there's always been a democratic opposition in Russia, and certainly since Vladimir Putin came to power, that democratic opposition has been present. But it lacked a real charismatic leader, and Navalny had the gift of both personal charisma and personal courage. And he had the ability to take issues of political opposition and make them concrete. He was best known for producing these fantastic videos exposing the corruption of Putin's elite, the mansions that they owned, their private lives in the south of France or on the Italian Riviera. And so he was able to crystallize many of the issues that mobilize ordinary Russians in a way that other opposition leaders simply had not been able to before him.
And how much of a threat was he to the Russian government? And I know that, President Putin has been on the scene for more than 10 years, should I say almost 20, because even when there was an election in Russia that he did not win, he did hand over to, who's the person who's currently Prime Minister, Medvedev, and then he came back again on the scene as president of Russia. So how much of a threat was Navalny to him? The fact that, he was on the scene a lot and, had held rallies that spoke against the Russian president and the Kremlin.
So it's a really interesting question. Navalny in Moscow, when he ran for mayor, got about a quarter of the vote. And that was probably, so the government had its hands on the scales a little bit there. But in Moscow, he got a quarter of the vote. And what matters is that Navalny appealed to people, particularly in the Russian elite, who saw Putin's regime as restricting their possibilities. The other thing about regimes like Putin's, authoritarian regimes, is that they depend on the aura of inevitability. They depend on the idea that there's no possible alternative. So the fact that Navalny was able to articulate and present an alternative Russian government, one that had genuine appeal to a lot of Russians, made him a threat. I think the best evidence that he's a threat is the clear attempt by Putin's regime to assassinate him in 2020. They poisoned him. on an aircraft, and he barely escaped with his life. And that in itself suggests that the regime thought he was a really serious threat to expose the level of discontent that corruption was creating.
Dr. Stone, if I may, I've spoken to someone here before, about what sort of politics that Alexei Navalny actually brought, the alternative that he brought to the Russian people, the alternative to Vladimir Putin. What was his main focus? What was his message really to the people? What was his manifesto, I guess, is what I'm asking. Because we've seen opposition figures rise in Russia, providing some sort of alternative, but having no clear direction on this and, what exactly is the alternative to Putin.
So the alternative that Navalny was articulating did not get into a lot of policy specifics. You're absolutely correct about that. What he did advocate was, at the base, corruption. Everybody hates corruption. Everyone in every country hates corruption. And Navalny was able to bring forward a lot of really compelling evidence of the nature of the corruption at the heart of Putin's regime. And so that in itself, his agenda was a government that wouldn't steal. In addition to that, he talked a lot about the rule of law, that Russia should be governed by laws and orderly procedures and not simply the whim of people in power. And that's a powerful message in a government like Putin's Russia. In authoritarian regimes, an end to corruption and a promise of the rule of law and some degree of democracy, that the government answers to the people, is an extremely powerful message. Now, what he would have done concretely if he had ever made it to the office of the Russian president, that's a really good question, and one that's impossible to answer and that now we will never know. His manifesto and his platform in more recent years really was stop stealing. He christened Russia's ruling party as the party of crooks and thieves, in a phrase that really resonated and had a lot of weight with the Russian people. That label stuck. And I think it speaks to the fundamental nature of his appeal.
Yeah, and the Russian people, of course, they don't speak freely, but we do know that they are, in a way, tired of the current regime in the Kremlin. Dr. Stone, to what degree is the Putin regime responsible for Navalny's death? You have his wife speaking in a video from Munich, where she's been staying, accusing the Russian president of killing the father of her children. Many leaders around the world believe that the Kremlin should be held responsible for Navalny's death. To what degree should that be?
So I think there's different ways of looking at this. The fundamental issue is Putin responsible in some level for Navalny's death. I think that's absolutely certain. Did Putin order that he be killed? We don't know. It's possible, but we don't know that. Did a figure in the regime think Navalny is better off out of the picture and act on his own? That's certainly possible. But at the most basic level, a man in his late 40s who had been poisoned by the regime and spent months in a coma, sending that man to solitary confinement in Russia's far north, that is, in a sense, a death sentence. And so in that degree, I think the regime is responsible for his death, whether or not Putin gave an order to say Navalny must die.
And I think Navalny knew his death was inevitable. I mean, the fact that he stood his ground against the Russian government and against the Russian president and continued to speak as much as he could from prison. What are the likely consequences, though, in Russia? Is this, his death, especially for the opposition, the other leaders who are around? I can't name anyone in particular right now, but I know that there are other people who are speaking against the Kremlin and the opposition, which is probably not as prominent right now as Navalny was.
You're certainly correct. As I mentioned earlier, Navalny had this charisma about him that made him, to a large degree, irreplaceable. Now, there are certainly other opposition figures, many of which have many personal qualities. But for the moment, at least, it's hard to see a figure that can take Navalny's place. Now, what are the consequences? One of the things that we've seen as a result of Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine is that opposition in Russia at this point has generally either left the country or it's in prison. There was a huge exodus of Russian opposition figures along with Russian skilled technical workers who could find employment elsewhere. They simply left the country when the war began. And so many potential the people who would go to the street to stand against the regime have left the country. The leaders who would coordinate such an action are either, as I said, in Vladimir Putin's jails or they themselves have left the country. So in the short run, it's hard to see a real threat to the regime from this. The question will be, how do Russians react when elections come? Presidential elections in Russia are coming up quite soon. And the regime can manipulate those elections. Regimes are always able to put a thumb on the scale in these sorts of authoritarian systems. Do Russians show up for the polls? Do they show up for the polls and write in Navalny's name? Do they vote for the other candidates on the ballot beside Vladimir Putin? These are questions that we don't know. We also don't know how much is the regime going to have to interfere in the elections. Judging by past events, what's happened in Russia is when the regime really has to do a lot to manipulate the elections and get the results it wants, the populations get angry. That happened in 2011 and 2012. There were massive demonstrations across Russia, which seem to have come in response to massive regime interference in election results. So there's a lot to be seen. Again, I don't see a leader who can put a group of people in the streets to protest against the regime. The question is this something that pushes more Russians to take more passive means of resisting, including participation or non-participation in the upcoming presidential elections?
And I'm sure you've thought about this also, Dr. Stone, what influence his wife could have, on Russian politics going forward or Russian activism going forward. How much of an influence do you think that she could have firstly from, the point of view that she was Navalny's wife, and then the fact that, she herself also tried, to some activism during his time?
Certainly. So she has obviously the factor of sympathy working on her behalf. The real question then becomes one of kind of internal politics within the Russian opposition. There's a lot of opposition scattered inside Russia, outside Russia. But what remains to be seen is, can Navalny's movement, which was very much centered on Navalny, can that movement transfer its leadership to his wife, Yulia, which is certainly one possibility, some other figure who can kind of take up the reins? Right now, what unites Russian opposition, generally speaking, is opposition to Putin and opposition to the war in Ukraine. Beyond that, it's harder to see the things that tie it together as an organization. One of the things that's been very true about Russia's democratic opposition for the last 20 years is that it tends to fragment. There's not a lot of common organization. The parties that you would see as leaning towards democratic reforms, towards the rule of law in Russia, in opposition to the current regime, there are always multiple parties. It's very difficult for Russian opposition figures to pull things together. And that's what was why Navalny's charisma was so important. Can his wife do that? Certainly, she has the possibility to. How that shakes out, how that ends up happening, it's a little too early to say, I think.
Yes, and for Navalny himself, he was quite popular outside of Russia. How was he really perceived? So
inside Russia, you have hints, tantalizing hints, that his appeal went beyond simply the traditional opposition in Russia, which is often urban elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg. One of the problems the Russian opposition has always faced is it's perceived as being people who are elite and westernized and not really in touch with the Russian people. Navalny had this common touch. And again, corruption is an issue that affects everyone. Everyone is touched by corruption, whether it's paying a bribe to a local official or seeing people amass hundreds of millions of dollars from serving in the Russian government. So corruption pulls people in. You can look at simple things like the number of views that Navalny's videos got on YouTube and other venues when he would post stories about corruption, into the tens and hundreds of millions. Really impressive numbers. And that itself suggests that this had resonance. This wasn't just a few elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but that Navalny's ability to talk about corruption had a resonance in other places and among other social sectors. The nature of Russian society now is that you can't depend on opinion polls. It's very hard to do good opinion polling in a society where opposition to the war can get you thrown in jail. But we have these hints that Navalny's message had some resonance. And who can pick up that torch and carry that now that he's gone is a very difficult question to answer.
Yeah, because I'm wondering, reading, some of the comments by some of these world leaders, for example, Joe Biden, the U.S. president, who referred to him as, who said the Kremlin was responsible for Navalny's death, the European Union chief, who says a bloc must send a message of support to the Russian opposition. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz saying that Navalny paid for his courage. It kind of really makes you wonder how much intervention they had in Navalny's situation when he was alive. There wasn't much outside of Russia about, these leaders saying anything about Alexei Navalny. For the period of time he was in solitary confinement, it seemed like he was, hidden from the rest of the world, and nobody really thought about what was going on with him, or what the Russian Kremlin or the regime was doing to Navalny while he was in prison.
That's an excellent point. And since you brought up the issue of U.S. politics, I should make clear I'm speaking only in a personal capacity. I'm not speaking in any official sense. One of the things I think you are correct that the world is filled with news. There's always things going on. There's the Ukraine war, the Hamas war, conflicts all over the place. So, and this is leaving aside questions of internal politics. Boko Haram in Nigeria, for example. There are things to pay attention to other than simply Alexei Navalny and what's going on in Russian opposition. And I absolutely understand that. So I think people like me who follow Russia paid a lot of attention to this. The other issue is that there are limited ways to put pressure on Russia's regime. The West has already imposed sanctions on Russia as a result of the war. Right. The West is providing support to Ukraine in its resistance to Russian invasion. But it's hard for the West to go beyond that. It's difficult for the West to reach out and do much more than to use words. Given everything else that's going on, there's limited ways that you can exert leverage on Vladimir Putin's regime. And so words are all you've got. Sometimes those words help, sometimes they don't. And clearly they weren't enough to save Alexei Navalny's life.
And since you mentioned the Russian invasion, very soon it will be marking 2 years, since Russian troops entered into Ukraine. And it seems like almost every city in Ukraine has been touched by Russian bombardments or airstrikes or anything like that, and the people really suffering. The extent of the damage caused in Ukraine. I mean, I think it would take years for the country itself to recover from the Russian invasion. No one is talking about the diplomacy in this, trying to get, Russia to stop. As you mentioned, rightly so, sanctions have been imposed on Russia, but they don't seem to be having any effect, on the government. They don't seem to. Instead, the government is reinforcing its decision to continue with, bringing Ukraine to its knees.
So I wouldn't say that the sanctions have had no effect. They've certainly not been enough to convince Vladimir Putin to stop this war. So they've had an effect in terms of Russia's access to high technology. Russia is able to get around the sanctions to some degree, but it takes time and trouble to do that. So if Russia wants access, say, to particular kinds of computer chips, it can do that through third parties, but that takes additional time and money. So the sanctions have had an effect in terms of damage to the Russian economy and in making the regime less able to do the things that it wants to do. And again, but the war is clearly important enough to Vladimir Putin that he is willing to pay those costs, particularly since in terms of economic suffering, those costs are going to be borne by the Russian people and not by Vladimir Putin himself. So that's what I would say in terms of the ability of the West to kind of compel it into the war. Now, in terms of negotiations, one of the things that's become very clear is that negotiations can only happen if there's a conceivable solution that both sides could accept. And Vladimir Putin has not backed off on his goals of denazifying Ukraine. He's not backed off on his goals of territorial annexation. Under Russian law, chunks of Ukraine that Russia does not yet occupy are Russian territory, so claims the Russian government. And to question that is to break Russian law. So it's not clear what an outline of a deal would look like and how you would achieve that. And Ukraine has found very little reason to trust any word that Vladimir Putin might give. And so, again, that makes negotiations more difficult. Can always happen, but at the moment, it's hard to see potential common ground between the two sides on which some sort of deal could emerge.
Yeah, it really does make sense. Really, no common ground for either side to move. Dr. David Stone, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you on The World Today. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we spoke about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine has launched an investigation now into allegations that Russian forces executed 8 unarmed Ukrainian soldiers after they took control of the city of Advika in the Donetsk region. While Moscow has not publicly responded to the claims, Russian troops wasted no time raising their country's flag in the ruined town after Ukrainian forces retreated. In what is known as the biggest gain for Moscow since the fall of Bakhmut, Russian President Vladimir Putin hailed the capture of the city as an important victory in the nearly 2-year-long war. However, in a call on Saturday with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, U.S. President Joe Biden directly tied Ukraine's withdrawal from the key town to Congress's inability to pass further aid for the country's efforts to fend off Russia's invasion.